Welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This episode of Poetry of Predicament, we're welcoming Mike Sliwa, alternative lifestyle thought leader and author. Should be a spicy conversation. Welcome, Mike Sliwa. All right. I am very pleased to be talking today with Mike Sliwa. Mike, it's just a pleasure to have you on the Poetry of Predicament. And I'm probably going to post this on a second podcast as well, the Impossible Conversation podcast, named after my book. And I'm just thrilled to have you on both of them and have you here for this conversation, because I've as I mentioned to you, heard you talking quite a few times in other interview settings, but especially with recent one with Hambone Littletail.
Right.
And you were talking about your the community that you're in, and of course, you know, your body of work and your previous writings, and you've got a kind of an illustrious career in the doomosphere.
Yeah.
So it's very much a pleasure to have you here, and I'm particularly looking forward to talking with you about one of the main themes in your recent book about privilege, and
Right.
and then bumping into that more and more as I'm creating the body of work with Carolyn Baker in Living Resilience. So without further ado, Mike Sliwa, thanks so much for joining us in here, and let us see your smiling face.
Well, thanks, Dean. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the time. And I look forward to this conversation because they are few and far between. And I'm actually very fortunate from where I live. I get to have them often, but it's nice to have them outside of the community as well, because it opens up possibilities for me, which being a doomer, self-proclaimed doomer, the possibilities seem to be more and more rare in my life. And it's good that people come out and want to talk and search me out once in a while and want to hear what I have to say about it. And but at the same token, it's good to hear what you're going to have to say about it as well. So
great. Well, Mike, would you, for those of us who are watching this podcast who don't know about you, would you mind giving us a little bit of an introduction to who you are and what got where you are?
Sure. I'm a former high school teacher. I taught high school for 12 years, and my wife and I left our teaching careers in 2011, not because we, had any problem necessarily teaching. We love the profession, and like everybody, we loved working with young people. We just didn't love the bureaucracy that came along with it. But we both wanted to do something more with our lives instead of showing up to a classroom for 20 more years and hoping for some sort of retirement. And we realized we really didn't have any tangible skill set. So we went out and we started working on people's properties on small homesteads. I think, woofing, working worldwide opportunities on organic farms, Help X, work exchange programs like that. And we basically started in the Southwest at Guy McPherson's place for 3 months. Then we went to Europe for about 6 months and woofed in Ireland and Italy, and then came back to the Southwest, and eventually ended up in an intentional community that is in Southwest New Mexico. And while I've been doing this over the last 6-7 years, I wrote a book called Chasing a Different Carrot, The Predicament of Privilege. And I've done some writing for the Good Men Project. I think I wrote about 75 articles for them about various things in the industrial culture. And I've given a couple TEDx talks about it as well, and appeared on Extinction Radio and, Humpty Dumpty Tribe, things like that, the doomer world. And so, yeah, I live on a property of about 20 acres with 12 other adults. We all have our own dwellings, but we also have common areas, bathhouses, kitchens, common gardens, and things like that. And it's called a land trust. It's basically a nonprofit. So That's who I am.
Right on. Well, I'm if you don't mind spending a couple moments, I think I've just mentioned to you that I have a real um, love for and long-standing appreciation for alternative living arrangements in this world because I think we're both very much on the same page that the way that the average person, especially in developed world like the USA, the way we live is completely and utterly unsustainable
Yeah.
and beyond what's current in terms of our climate footprint and decimation of habitat and on the list goes. I've also just called it forever two in a box, where if you just have a couple that lives in their little apartment or their house and they're sequestered in that world, there's so little contact, so
Yeah.
little meaningful contact with other people. Can you say just a little bit about your experience of that, and especially where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I, when we got married, we lived in a studio apartment in the mid 90s in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we only lived together 2 years before we moved to the Southwest. And we actually lived with my parents for 16 years in Phoenix. We shared living expenses. We shared a 2-story home. And it really worked out well for a long time. We kind of used to call ourselves the Waltons. And people would be shocked that we could live together like that. But we got along great. And when we decided to leave, my parents were somewhat shocked. And because everything was going well, we weren't leaving because of them. We weren't leaving because we hated our jobs. We just felt a need with, uh, to do something else and not wait around for retirement. I used to tell this story when I'd come to work in the morning and I go to my mailbox at school. I used to have to walk down this hallway. And in the hallway, there were portraits of the senior class and the teachers that would teach the seniors. And each year I would walk by these portraits, and some of the teachers that I knew, they would just, each year they would get a little older looking and a little older looking. And I'm like, I cannot be on this portrait someday. And and so I knew I wasn't a lifer. And I knew that from the very beginning after college, once I started working, that I was not a person who could show up to a building for the next 30 or 40 years of my life and do something like that. And so once we decided to take this leap, we quickly found out, once we started working with people on their properties, that all people were really doing was taking their life from the cities and taking it to a rural setting and making it harder on themselves, because now they didn't have the convenience of running to the hardware store if they needed something. So they weren't really living, in community still. They were still out in the middle of nowhere by themselves, just as if they were living in a neighborhood that was surrounded by brick walls like Phoenix is, by themselves. And so they didn't really learn anything. They were just making it harder on themselves, and it was more rural. Sure, it was more beautiful and the air quality was better, but they brought us in because they needed help. They just had bit off more than they can chew, like most people are doing. And we learned real quick, by living and working with folks, we learned more what not to do. And what we did not want to do was basically build a structure in the middle of nowhere and start a homestead by ourselves, because we didn't want to work 16-hour days, and we just gave up 12-hour days in a windowless classroom. So we found out and kind of stumbled upon intentional communities and read about a bunch, went and visited Dancing Rabbit in Missouri, and kind of got an idea of what we wanted to do. And it just so happens, when we were working at Guy's place, there was an intentional community about a mile down the road from him. And we used to go to potlucks when we were in the area. And so we started going to their potlucks every Sunday for years, and eventually became really close with them and were invited into the community. And living within this community, I thought I was living in community, and I knew what it was just from living with my folks and having roommates. But this is much more hands-on, I think. This is much more supportive in everybody's needs. Like, for example, we're working on somebody's house right now, and this woman lived in a school bus for years, and it's just really been cold, and she's getting older. And so collectively we raised money, and collectively we built a house basically around her school bus, because she loved the bus, but we put a house around it. And it just kind of happened. There wasn't a lot of planning. There wasn't a lot of discussion about it. It's just that somebody in my immediate community was uncomfortable, and we wanted to make them comfortable. And whatever it took, we got it done. And those types of things were completely foreign to me. Everything had a plan. Everything had a cost-benefit analysis. Everything was, thought about and talked about to death without anything actually seeming to happen. And here on this small property, things happen because there aren't major systems and institutions separating me from people. I see people's immediate suffering now, and we address it. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I've learned, and the biggest gift that's been given to me by, I guess, stepping outside of that classroom and leaving my credit score behind. So,
yeah. Well, thank you for that. And something from the upcoming summit that Carolyn and I are doing in February of 2018. We're just in the last week of January as we're recording this interview. One of the guest speakers in that summit, Philip Shepard, talks about the natural expression of service that seems to come
right.
when a person is deeply connected. His entire orientation is connecting with ourselves, with our deeper selves, and he's talking about doing that through the body, and he's masterful at that. And what I remember from that set of interviews was he kept bringing up this notion of service being on the other side. So if not the head-oriented and separation-oriented world that we live in by default,
right,
then what? And what I kind of saw those things floating together, what you were just saying and what Philip Shepard was saying, where just as a natural expression of your participation in this community, you're sensitive to, and it's like, of course,
yeah,
that to be of service to the person in need. It's not something to have to figure out. It's just a natural occurrence.
yeah. You just to hate to quote Nike, but yeah, you just do it, and it just happens. And that's what was amazing to me, is that things just sort of manifest here. And it feels, and this is a word that gets overused in some cases, but it just felt totally organic, and it just sort of flowed. And that's what I've only been on this property 2 years, but I feel like the more I've let go of what I conceptualize and what I think it should be, the more I just say, okay, I'm just gonna trust what's happening in this process and what's gonna happen day to day. And shit just happens. It literally, things just go, and they get done, and they don't get done in a way that people are used to things getting done. They don't always get done in an orderly fashion on a particular time schedule and, by a budget, but they happen, and I've trusted that they will happen. And time after time again, they get done, and they're more amazing than I ever anticipated they could possibly be. So.
Well, if you don't mind a little shift of gears with
No.
that, the orientation that Carolyn and I are taking on is really to offer as many powerful tools and opportunities to build skills and expand capacity as possible for
Right.
people as they face a predicament-laden world. And one of the bigger pieces of just a learning piece, because most people have zero comprehension of it, is about shadow. And why I'm bringing it up is shadow is hard for me to take apart the words, in the right there in the title of your book, and as a central focus of so many pages in it is about privilege. And
Yeah.
really what's implied with that is that whole separation based paradigm of
Hmm.
default living in business as usual. Um,
Yeah.
and because we are so uh, grief adverse and loss adverse and death adverse and community adverse and vulnerability adverse, it seems like we've literally knocked out all of the aspects of being a human being that would be
Right.
helpful. We've literally just stripped them all out.
Yeah.
And the way that you're one of the main focus points that you bring forth so well is about privilege, how we've got all the benefits of the fossil fuel driven fantasy world.
Yeah.
And we are obviously deeply addicted to this, the most luxurious way of being a human being that's ever been.
Right.
And that, if nothing else, that constitutes like a foundation of privilege. And that foundation is built on shadow, is built on the aspects of ourselves that we refuse to see.
Right. Yeah.
We refuse to see that we've stripped out all those essential connections to our deeper self, to other people, to earth, and so on. So I'm wondering, is there anything that you're inclined to say about just how privilege shows up on your screen now after grappling with that topic for so many years now?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you bring this up. The timing couldn't be better. In my book, I talked briefly about presenting at the White Privilege Conference in 2008. And it was a monumental shift in my thinking because I thought I knew on some levels the privilege I had. And then I had been to the conference several times, and then I was asked to present, and I presented with a friend of mine. And it was let's just put it this way, it did not go as planned. And it was a very teachable moment for us. I mean, I learned a great deal more than I was probably giving out as far as the information goes. And I walked away from that moment thinking, and rightly so, that I don't actually really know anything. And I think I do. I've been looking, like all of us, we look through the world basically through a pinhole, and then we try to explain it to ourselves and other people and how it works, basically through our perceptions and things like that. And I found that moment had helped spiral me into a completely different direction. And the person that I did my co-presenter that day has taken a different route for different reasons, but he is now in a doctoral education leadership program at Harvard. And I ended up living in a tent in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And so in April, 10 years after that event, we are presenting again at the White Privilege Conference about what happened and how we have responded to the world since that day. And we're basically going to talk about progressive approach to injustice and oppression and inequity, and versus a radical approach. And we're going to talk about that. And so for me, the hardest people to talk to about privilege are the people that actually understand their own privilege as far as their race and their nationality and their gender and in everything like that. What they cannot see, and I am not probably going to be well received at this conference again, is they have a hard time seeing what's directly right in front of them, and that is the privilege of living in the industrial era. And they've become really the subject, and it's this quest on some levels to be included in a society that excludes so many people on so many levels because it's a hierarchy. There's no top without a bottom, there's no wealth without poverty, and there's no privilege without oppression. And want to be included in something that is traditionally excluded so many and is devouring the planet, literally your lives, is an interesting thing and most difficult to get across to progressive thinkers, because they believe deeply in the system, perhaps more than any other political ideology. And yet I came from a very progressive thinking background. And so my challenge will be in 90 minutes to try and get them to get a glimpse of the predicament. We want to include more people, but as one of my Facebook friends, Ian McDonald, stated the other day, if we just have a more diverse set of gatekeepers, that's actually not helping anything. All we're doing, if we have a transgender drone pilot and we have, a lesbian senator and, and so on and so forth, if those people are all pursuing the same living arrangement and promoting and perpetuating the same living arrangement, then we're really not getting anywhere. We're just feeling better about it because now it's more diverse.
Right.
And that's really where I am at this moment. It's like, I'm a white guy, a white straight male, born in the upper middle class in the United States, educated the whole bit. I am not the messenger or the best looking messenger to be saying this to women, people of color, so on and so forth. However, that doesn't change the fact that it's accurate. And the accuracy of the message is what's keeping us alive is ultimately killing us. That's the predicament. And people don't want to hear that because they've invested so much of their identity into who and what they do, who they are and what they do. Teachers are the perfect example of this, being in the profession. A lot of us, we think we're the last bastion of hope. But what we're really doing is we are preparing people to follow the same path that we have followed. And that path is incarceration for yourself and destruction of what's keeping you alive. I don't know how to put it any more plainly than that, but people don't want to hear that shit, Dean.
Yeah. Well, I'm with you. I have my own brand, as you can imagine, with a book called The Impossible Conversation.
Yeah.
I've had my share of impossible conversations, and it's easy to hear what you're talking about. I'm with you. And I'm curious if we might shift gears one more time, just a slightly different layer of a similar topic. Just so to put it into the barest minimum context for someone who might not be aware of this, what's sometimes called the doomosphere or the near-term human extinction crowd, and that's on support groups on Facebook and so on. There's a small fraction of the population around the world that just has this level of collapse awareness, and they bind together in some social media loose way. And there's some personalities that are better known than others, and there's of course, like any affiliation, any group of people, there's going to be dramas, there's going to be ups and downs in relationships and so on. And so what I'm vaguely pointing at, and I don't need to get any more specific, but what I would like to get specific about is, it's one thing to try and have these excruciating conversations like the one you're formulating for this conference that you're going to go speak at. I mean, that's going to be a tough row to hoe no matter what you do. And my hat's off to you, and I hope you record it, and I hope we get a chance to see what comes out of it. Because really, I'm not kidding. I'd be very interested in seeing it.
Yeah.
But what I'm also looking at is working on the skill sets and working on the kind of cultivating an environment of mutual willingness to grow together at the level of those of us who are more or less on the same wavelength.
Mm-hmm.
People who aren't such a tough sell, because mostly we're on the same page.
Yeah.
what's kind of more than a little tragic to me is that there is no built-in benefit. There's no wisdom bestowed upon a person who becomes collapse aware of the collapse of human and Earth systems. There's just none. It is something that something of a relief to meet someone who's engaged in the same conversations. That's
Right.
all. Well,
Yeah.
to find somebody that you can talk with and it's safe and you won't be ridiculed and so on. But what I'm noticing is there's this tragedy of we are no better, but those of us who are engaged and have this knowledge and some amount of desire to connect with others about it, we got no guarantee that we've got any better skills at connecting with people than anyone outside of this conversation.
Right.
There's not a damn bit, there's not a lick of more common sense or more innate ability to reconnect with inner wisdom or other people or earth or spirit or soul. And so we get to this incredibly vulnerable place because it's a heretical conversation. I know you know this probably better than anybody. And so it is a belligerent conversation with anyone outside of the circle.
Right.
But within the circle, we still have the same default judgments. Still have the same kind of shadow ugliness that we all carried around when we were, willfully ignorant and and driving around in bliss out in the regular world.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, because you've been engaged in some of this, firsthand in terms of having to grapple with some of those shadows and how to do that and what you've noticed. I'd just be very curious if you have any kind of lessons learned or observations as you've seen people kind of perhaps in our own clumsy way trying to stay connected in some loose way around the world with all this shadow flying around, just slicing, like death by 1,000 cuts with each other and still trying to stay connected. So anything to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the part of the problem, obviously is we all come from the civilized model. So like I said about not knowing anything, I mean, truly in some sense, coming into and trying to, as I call it, move towards the exit of the insanity of this culture and peeling off the immense amount of conditioning and doing so by, picking up, and I quit my job and I moved to a rural area and now I'm hammering nails and I'm milking goats and blah, blah, blah. And, still being a highly dysfunctional person and not knowing really how to connect with anything that's non-human, let alone humans, and stumbling my way through it, and then coming into a community where I have other people stumbling their way through it and who are just as dysfunctional as I am, and trying to grasp onto anything as we're spiraling through this, immense amount of grief of coming to these places, these very dark places. It's a clusterfuck because we are all just clueless on some level. And yet many of us, including myself at many times, think we know what we're talking about and we know what we're doing. And we try, and it's not to say we don't all have something to give and some gifts to share and things like that. But I think on many levels, we're trying to create something that has never been created. A post, carbon existence of a bunch of people who know nothing else except living in the industrial model and and whatever skill sets or knowledge we gain, passing that on to, if there are fortunate enough to have future generations, will be interesting. It would be interesting to see if I would could live another couple hundred years if that even is possible for people to be around. But it's just, I think we do the same things. We grab onto gurus, we look for leadership, and we don't do what's required from the very beginning. And that, I think, is self-inquiry. I think there's very little self-inquiry going on. And what we want to do is we want to skip the self-inquiry part, which is the really hard part. And we want to get to the homesteading or the plan to bring down empire, or whatever approach we take, being rewilding, whatever it is. But what we fail to do is really delve into what we are. And I think one of the things that blew my mind recently, I've been reading a lot of stuff on enlightenment and Zen things and things of the Hindu faith and shamanism. And somebody somewhere said, the problem that you have is you think you're a person. And I went, oh shit. Like, yeah, I just took what was assumed, I took a blunt tool language and just applied it to myself because it was given to me. And that was the narrative that I was given. And I went, yeah, of course I am, because that's what somebody told me I was. And now this is what people do. And just to think about that now for several months and go, what does that even mean? That am I a person? Am I the body? Am I the mind? Am I my thoughts? Am I the consciousness? What am I beyond that? I mean, what am I really? What am I? And what the hell am I actually what am I doing? Or what a better question, what do I think I'm doing? And really delving into those things, and then try moving through the world. And for me, this has been a whole process for the last 7 years of just letting go of all the layers that I have placed upon myself and that the world has placed upon me. And so for me, it's all about delving inward.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Well, Mike, if I've got one leaning in this kind of conversation, it's to go in a similar direction where we've both been going in this particular conversation. But I'd like you to, if you would, just take us a little bit further in the direction of how do you and your spouse, you and the other people in this little community, can you talk a little bit about ways you keep yourselves connected, ways you keep yourselves a little bit less encumbered by the usual shadow stuff of the business as usual world? How do you keep yourselves sane in the midst of it all?
I mean, honestly, it becomes more and more difficult. The longer I live here, it becomes more and more difficult to leave. Like, I have to go to Phoenix so often and do things and once in a while. My parents still live there. I present every once in a while. And every time I come back, we have a talk amongst, because there's coffee clutch going on right now. There's potluck every Sunday. And I usually go down and a couple days a week and struggle through the news with, a couple of my community members. And we have conversations like you and I have them daily. And that's what keeps me sane. And sometimes I have them while I'm helping build a place, or I'm taking a hike, or the other day I was weaving a basket. And I have those conversations while sometimes learning new skill sets. And to me, it's a combination of things. It's this self-reflecting all the time, and it's being able to have an outlet to talk about these things, because I think so many doomers are isolated and they cannot talk about these things because they're by themselves, and they're in Portland in their apartment complex, and they're only online. Their only thing release is online. And so I do this combination of talking to my neighbors, reflecting upon myself, and learning new things, and in a sense, rewiring my fucked up brain. And the biggest thing is, I tell people, because we this whole idea, and people get crucified in this particular community of doomers for having any hope. And I've been as guilty as anybody else. The whole word hopium gets thrown around. I don't have any hope, and I'm okay now that people that do have hope. But I just tell people this: once I gave up hope, it absolutely liberated me. And it set me free on so many levels that I can't even describe. And I literally wake up every day blissful. And that's the best way of putting it, because I don't have any major expectations of how this is going to go, because I just don't know. And so the combination of those things, I guess I found my place in the world and the way I can navigate it now the best. And that'll change again. If I talk to me in a year from now, I'm sure there'll be new things that I've completely discovered and gone, oh, I never thought of that. And like, oh, you're a person? Really? So I hope that helps.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I'd be curious if in the name of wrapping this up and kind of putting a bow on it, if you think particularly of young people who are just starting to articulate who they are in the world, and they're grappling, they seems like many young people now at least have a rumbling in their guts that this isn't working, that the business as usual paradigm is not working, and they don't quite know what that means. They don't know the extent of it, but they know it's not working.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, especially, geez, you've had some considerable experience talking with high school kids. That's roughly what I'm talking about. If you could put together something of a, I don't really know. I don't hear you as a guy who would give advice, but do you have something that you could offer? Do you have an offering that you can put out?
I'll tell you, my last year of teaching, and I knew I was leaving, so it was no holds bar. I was like, I'm going to say what I want. And I did throughout the years. I taught American history and I taught American literature. And I wove those things together with, at the time I was reading Derek Jensen's Endgame, and I was reading, Daniel Quinn, Ishmael. And so all of that came to fruition and came in. The very first thing I wrote on the board on the first day of my last year teaching was, where does I said, basically, why are we here? Why are we in school? And I helped lead them, but they got to the point, it's because we lock up the food. And I got that from Daniel Quinn. And really what I've and I'm going to have to speak to some young people who are going into the teaching profession right before I do this white privilege conference. And they are just about to enter their student teaching portion of their education. And really what I ask people is, what is this? It's all throughout my book. What's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and who told you that story, and why do you believe them? And then we just break it down from there. And if you can start there, that's a form of self-inquiry that I think you can look at on a personal level, and then how I participate in larger institutions and systems. Because the story we tell ourselves personally is highly impacted and molded by the narrative we were all born into. Pursue an education, pursue a career, pursue upward mobility. That's it. And so if you can break that down and ask yourself, why the heck am I doing what everybody else is doing? And then looking at the results and going, oh, the results are not working out, because everybody wants to take a traditional approach and they want an alternative result, and they're not getting it. You cannot take traditional approaches and get non-traditional results. So my little parting thing of wisdom is, if you want to do something different, then you got to start from a different place. And people are unwilling to do that because obviously it's a fear of losing control. And again, that comes all back to looking within yourself and going, well, what am I, and what am I really doing, and how's that working out, to quote Dr. Phil. So
yeah. Excuse me. We've we've got something of a conference coming up here in May in Southern Oregon as well. Really exciting. I'm looking forward to it. There's some great folks putting it together. really about exactly the stuff we're talking about. And
Yeah.
one thing I was suggesting as they were, one of the leaders of it was asking me for just some opinions about ways to set a container, create a container in that conference so that people could feel like it was safe to have these extraordinarily confronting conversations. You know, these
Right.
are
Yeah.
tough ass conversations. And you know what came to mind? What came to mind was really similar to what I heard you just saying. A piece of it is that you know what you were inviting those high school students and what these folks who are putting together the conference in May up here. What you're doing is you're inviting people to the most threatening, confronting, existential based conversation that human beings have ever had to grapple with.
Yeah.
This is the largest scale expression of violence that human beings have ever had to confront.
Yeah.
It's maybe slow motion violence, but anyway, what I heard you doing was inviting them to find an extraordinary amount of courage. You know, to step outside of that business as usual model that
Yeah.
we all call normal. That takes
It's hard.
courage.
Yeah, it takes courage, but I tell people, because when my wife and I left, Dean, this comes back all the way around to the beginning of the conversation with privilege. It does take courage, but I think I look at the amount, and again, this is from my particular set of circumstances, but there's a lot of people in my circles and people that might listen to these conversations that I might influence. In a lot of cases, a lot of people who have privilege already. I had a huge safety net. We both had a huge safety net underneath us. I mean, if I went out and left my job and, sold my cars and, did what I did, if it didn't work out, I have an education. I can go back and get a teaching job. I can go back and start my, getting a car and start my old life again pretty quickly. And so it's not like I was born into a Syrian refugee camp and I'm dying of cholera. So it's not, the fear is all in here, and it's really it's that story we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's ultimately what we conceptualize, and it's not real. It's just, as Derek says, it's the culture of make believe. And if you can literally, it's like looking at one of those illusions, and if you look at it long enough, this 3D thing comes out at you, and if you stare at it long enough, you literally see that what you've been looking at the whole time isn't really even there. It's something entirely different. And that, if you can get to that, and the only way you can is really just delving in of what am I doing? What am I telling myself about myself? All this self-talk. And who is actually saying this to myself? If you can go there, it's amazing what you will find. And what you will find is that everything around you is absolutely utter bullshit. And it's not like you're going to escape it, but you can find an entirely new way to navigate it. And that's what I've attempted to do. And it's the best thing I've ever done in my life. And if I died after this interview, I'm at least thankful that I found some form of liberation and bliss. So,
Yeah. My word for that is grace, a state of grace.
Grace.
And
absolutely. That's a great way of putting it.
So Mike Sliwa, now all I want to do is get my ass down to that area and visit with y'all at some point, because it just seems like
you're welcome to come.
A remarkable place. I used to work for a company years ago out of Silver City called Vision Quest.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And it was a remarkable wilderness camp. It was a great program. But
right on. Yeah. Come on down, man. Carolyn has been here, so she can tell you a little bit about it.
Great.
Yeah, she was here before I even lived here, so.
Right on.
Yeah, she's always welcome back too. So come on down, and we'll get you set up.
All right. Well, Mike Sliwa, thank you so much for spending time. I really look forward to hopefully many more conversations and possibly visits. And I really look forward to hopefully you'll post that the video of
Well,
your talk that's coming up. And as much as you might have tried to reframe it, I'm just going to go back to it. I think you and your spouse and that little community you're in are a number of courageous people, and I just appreciate the heart that you bring to it. It's obvious to me; it's just clear as a bell, and absolutely a pleasure to talk with you.
well, thanks for the opportunity, and I appreciate your work, your voice, and it's nice and refreshing to talk to somebody who is genuine. So, thank you.
All right. Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.